Day.
And I'm Richard Day.
We're both chiropractors.
We've been in practice together for 11 years.
Married for 10.
With 3 beautiful little girls.
We know it's possible to have an exceptional practice that's built around your life.
Because we've done it.
So we've created this podcast,
the Lifestyle Practice Builders Podcast.
We'll interview chiropractors, answer questions, and bring you resources to help build and grow your practice.
So let's get this party started.
Welcome back to the Lifestyle Practice Builders Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Haley Day, and today I'm going to talk about you being a podcast guest. So if you're interested in being on a podcast, maybe someone's asked you to be on their podcast or you were looking to be on someone's podcast, then I'm going to give you some tips, some hints that will help you along the way. So today's episode, I'm going to talk about what you need to think about or do if you ever have the opportunity to be on a podcast. The first thing you want to ask yourself is, should you even be on the podcast? And you want to make sure it's a good fit. So if someone asks you to be on their podcast, is being on that person's podcast a good fit for you? Do you know the podcast? Do you know the host? If not, then before you say yes, I recommend listening to a few episodes, do a little online research, and make sure that it is a good fit for you, because you're going to spend some time putting your stuff together to be on the podcast, and you want to make sure that it is worth your time. So as you're searching, if it feels like it's a good fit, then start thinking about what you have to share that would be of value to the podcast audience. These can be things you've written blogs about, shared on social media, or maybe they're tips you share often with patients when they come into your office. For example, this week I was on Josh Satterley's podcast, Clinic Gym Radio. On his podcast, I shared the 5 things you must know before you start a practice. If you've been listening to our podcast, then you know that is something that I've spent a lot of time putting together and talking about. We have a free ebook on our website. It talks all about the 5 things you must know before you start a practice. So his podcast audience is made up of chiropractors and physical therapists that want to have a clinic gym hybrid. And Josh has been on our podcast as well. So those are fundamental elements, the 5 things you must know before starting a practice that are important for students wanting to eventually open a clinic gym hybrid or maybe add a gym to their clinic in the future. Everyone needs to build those foundational elements in order to succeed with their end goal. And so Josh and I had a great conversation about all 5 as they affect the success of every practice. And the topic was good for both of us to talk about and bring the most value the 2 of us could bring to his podcast audience together. So you can see that we found something that would work that I could talk about to bring value to his audience. And that's what you really want to do, is make sure that you find something that you enjoy talking about, you have a good background about, and you can bring to that audience and bring them value. Now, if you haven't been asked to be on the podcast, but you found a podcast you'd like to be on, then send them a message. You can send an email, text, a DM on Facebook or Instagram. Introduce yourself. Let the host know that you've listened to their podcast and what you like about the podcast episode you listen to. Then introduce yourself and share the topic that you'd like to share on their podcast that you think might be interesting to their audience. You can even list 3 topics and let them pick one. They might like one more than the others, or they might like to touch on 2 or all 3 of them. So giving them those options helps them know how you're going to be there to serve their audience. If you don't get a response back from them, then I'd follow up a week later. And if there's still no answer, I tried one more time using maybe a different avenue. If you sent an email, try calling or sending a DM on social media. And if there's still no answer, start interacting with them on Instagram by liking and commenting on posts, share their stories, etc. You don't want to get crazy. Don't be a stalker, but authentically interact. And this could even be something you start to do, or maybe you're already interacting with them before you pitch them what you would like to, the value that you would like to bring to their audience. And so you are, like we always talk about, you are creating a relationship with them and then letting them know how you would like to bring some value to their audience. And I think that that will be very well received. And if you're not a good fit for them, or maybe they don't do interviews, then maybe it won't work out, but that's a good way to start. So Once you've gotten the okay and you've scheduled with a podcaster, you want to make sure that you have a nice quality portrait picture to share with them and a short to the point bio. And the bio should be detailed to the reason you're on the podcast. If it's a podcast for moms, then what makes you most qualified to share with moms the information that you have? If it's for athletes, then stress the things that make you most qualified to work with athletes, and get help from someone if this isn't your strength, because the bio is really important. It's going to be something they say on the podcast. It'll be something in each of the social media posts probably. So you want to make sure it's very geared towards your ideal patient that you're trying to bring into the office. And bios are extremely important. We revise ours often, make sure they are speaking to our ideal patient, and include updated credentials. And use words that people know. I don't know if everyone knows ART certified if you're not going to be on a sports athlete podcast. So make sure that what you say is going to pique the interest of the person listening. Next, this is an extremely important piece, so listen up. Prepare yourself. What is your message? Do you want more of your ideal patients coming into your office from the podcast? And what words will you use to connect with those people? So you have to have a message, and you have to know how you are going to get that message across so that people understand and can connect with you. And what will help you do this is possibly writing blogs about the topics, write an ebook, create a resource for the person that you can give out on the podcast. But if you start to work on these types of content, you will start to have a voice for what you're saying. You know, that 5 things you must know about starting a practice, it was just a thought that I had. And I started by making a list, and then I wrote the ebook, and then I took each of the topics and created a podcast. And if you've listened to those podcasts, then you know the amount of detail that I went into and the hours that I used to develop not just the ebook, but then the podcast to go along with them. And so that's what you want to do, and it will really help you find your voice for what you want to share. And that's going to be really important if you do make it onto a podcast. So I recommend 3 to 5 points that you'll hit on the podcast and why those are important. And then most importantly, what are the next steps someone can take if they're interested in working with you? So can they send you a DM on Instagram? Can they go to your website? Can you create a short URL for them to get the resource? For example, we use jointhefoundation.com, therofsystem.com, and chiroplanner.com. And these just cost us $15. You can point them to a certain page on your website, and you don't have to develop each one out as a website. So if you have a wellness ebook, maybe you can buy wellnessebook.com and point that to some helpful information on your website where these people can go to. And that's called a call to action, and you want it to be easy. So if I want to like I was on Josh Satterley's podcast, and so people listening to his podcast like podcasts. And so the easiest thing for me to recommend is to have those people, his audience, find our podcast. And that's easy. And then I think I gave a website. So I want it to be easy. I don't want it to be a 5-step process. I want whoever's listening to that podcast, and maybe they're in their car, it's going to be easy for them to remember, hey, I'm going to go listen to the Lifestyle Practice Builder podcast next, or I'm going to go to lifestylepracticebuilders.com. So you can see where my call to action is very simple, and I don't try to give too many. So I just want them to be able to find me, and the amount of other things that they find, if they find the podcast or they go on our website, then that's great. But I want them to, if they're interested in us as a resource, then it's an easy step from his podcast to our podcast. So what is that easy step for the listeners for you? Do you want them to find you on Instagram? Do you want them to find your website? Do you want to buy an easy website URL for $15? Or, I don't even think you need to spend that much. Maybe I've bought some recently, I think for like $1.42. So we use Namecheap.com. That's an easy place to find a URL that can point directly to something on your website. So, and that's great, useful. I mean, that's something you can use for a lot of things, not just being on someone else's podcast. So good little tip there, can be used for lots of different things. So ultimately, what is the value that you bring to the audience for the podcast? And what is your call to action for the audience? These are the two most important things when it comes to being on the podcast. And if you remember nothing else from this, please remember those two things. It's really important that you know what you're there to talk about and that there's a way for those people to connect with you if they really enjoyed the podcast. So on the day of the podcast, these are some things that you want to make sure you do. You want to be on time. You want to be in a quiet place. You want to have a quality internet connection and equipment that will work. And equipment is not a big deal. All those other things are so important. It's quiet. You have a good internet connection. The rest is just a computer to hop on Zoom. You can even do that from your phone. And then it helps to have a set of headphones with a mic, or you can be on your computer and use the mic there as long as you're in a quiet area. So also, turn off notifications on your computer, silence your phone, and silence your kids, dogs, spouse, whatever else might be home with you. It's best if no one's there. No one's in the house right now with me, and I had 15 minutes. That's why I'm doing this now. So find a quiet space, good quality internet, and equipment that you have. After the podcaster is going to go to a lot of work to edit the podcast and get it ready to post on their site. It is a lot of work, or it's expensive work that they're having someone else do. So for them to take the interview, create a final product, and market the podcast is a lot of work. And they are really helping you out by letting you come on and talk and share value. You're bringing value to their audience, and they're bringing value by spreading your message. So the best thing that you can do is to help promote and share the podcast interview through all of your social media accounts. And I'm blown away by the amount of guests that we have on our show that don't use the podcast to promote themselves and share it on their Facebook, their Instagram, or in their Facebook group, because this sharing aspect is what helps people hear your voice. And a podcast is such a great way to help people get to know you and how they can work with you. It builds a connection that is very different from the text only on IG or Facebook. And so as long as you are authentic, you provide value, and you really connect the dots for a possible future patient or buyer of your program, then they will follow your call to action and find you. So help share the content in whatever way you can. So I'm going to bring it all together here. Podcasts are a phenomenal way to connect with future patients or people that if you have an online program, you can bring them into that program. So find local podcasts or health-focused podcasts where you can bring some value, connect with the podcaster to be a guest on their show, and create the content that will bring the most value to their audience. Show up as your best self and share the episode anywhere you can once it's out. So I hope these tips helped. If you have any questions, reach out to me on Instagram at Lifestyle Practice or Dr. Haley Day. I look forward to hearing from you all and listening. Let us know when you're on a podcast so we can share it for you. And we hope you have an awesome weekend.
If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please share it with your friends on Instagram and Facebook. And for those of you who are already subscribers, we really appreciate it. Thanks for the reviews. We love reading those and knowing that you're loving the podcast. If you're looking for more tips and inspiration, be sure to check us out at lifestylepracticebuilders.com or join our business and marketing Facebook group for chiropractors at facebook.com/group/lifestylepractice.